Imagine waking up before dawn on a damp straw mattress, stomach already growling. There's no coffee, no cereal, no fridge humming in the corner. Instead, someone throws another log into the hearth, and your first hope of food begins with fire. In the Dark Ages, eating wasn't about taste or pleasure, it was about survival, and often, even that was a luxury. Let's begin with the peasants, the backbone of medieval society, and also the hungriest. Their diet was brutally simple and season-dependent. Bread was the core of every meal, not soft or fluffy, but dense, coarse, and sometimes even gritty from stone-ground flour. In hard times, bark, acorns, or ground beans were mixed in to make it stretch. They ate pottage, a sort of eternal stew made of oats, water, herbs, and whatever vegetables they had, leeks, onions, parsnips, or beans. If they were lucky, they might flavor it with bacon fat or throw in a bone from last week's pig slaughter. Meat, rare, salted or smoked, shared during feast days or after a slaughter in the village. Protein came from eggs, cheese, or the occasional salted fish if you lived near the coast. Chickens were valuable not for meat, but for their eggs. Killing a hen meant losing days of food. Most peasants lived largely vegetarian lives, not by choice but by necessity. Water wasn't always safe to drink, so even children drank ale, weak, low-alcohol beer made in households, not for fun, but because it was safer than the well. And wine only for the nobility and monks. Now step into a nobleman's hall and the story changes. Here, meals were a performance, multiple courses of roast meats, pies, and even exotic spices brought by merchants from the east. Salted venison, honey-glazed fowl, and thick trenchers of bread served as plates. The wealthy could afford sugar, a rare and precious luxury, and spices like cinnamon, pepper, and cloves. They weren't just for taste. These ingredients showed status, told guests, I control trade, land, and the world beyond this village. But even with all this wealth, famine didn't discriminate. From the 6th to the 10th centuries, crop failure, early frost, or flooding could turn abundance into disaster. A single bad harvest meant hunger, two meant starvation. There were years when people ate grass, animal feed, even strips of leather boiled into desperate soup. Chronicles from the time speak of parents selling children, of villages abandoned, of corpses left unburied. Hunger wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. People believed famine was punishment from God, a test of humility or a judgment on sins. That fear was real, gnawing, and sacred, and yet, in the middle of it all, they shared. In many villages, the poorest were still given bread from the Lord's kitchen. Leftover stew was left on church steps. During holy days, no one, not even beggars, was to go hungry. So what did they eat? Just enough. What did they starve without? Mercy, weather, and hope. In the Dark Ages, a full belly wasn't just nourishment, it was a miracle. A sign that for one more day, you had won the battle against a world that seemed designed to take it all away. Winter in the Dark Ages was not a season, it was a siege. It crept in through every crack in the walls. It froze the water in your cup and the tears in your eyes. It took the weak, the old, and the unprepared. And worst of all, it overstayed its welcome, often lasting from November until well into April. Let's start with heat. The average peasant family lived in a one-room hut made from wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and timber. There were no chimneys, the fire pit sat in the center of the dirt floor, and the smoke had nowhere to go but up through holes in the roof or into your lungs. Children, chickens, and sometimes even pigs shared that space, not for love, but for warmth. They didn't have blankets in the way we do. Instead, they used furs, rough wool, and layered linens if they were lucky enough to have them. People slept close together for body heat, and beds were sometimes just straw piled in corners. In really bad winters, people would go to sleep fully dressed, huddled together like animals, which in truth they were fighting to not become. As for the nobility, they fared better with stone castles that still leaked wind, tapestries on the walls to block drafts, and hearths in large halls. But even the richest could wake to frost on their pillow. Winter was the great equalizer, even kings could catch cold and die of fever. Now let's talk about something we don't associate with the Dark Ages, cleanliness. There's a myth that people in the early Middle Ages didn't bathe. That's not true, not entirely. Public bathhouses were still in operation in some cities, especially in former Roman regions like Gaul and Byzantium. These were places of hygiene, social life, and even medicine. People believed washing the body helped purify the soul. Some monasteries required regular bathing as part of spiritual discipline. Peasants bathed less frequently, but they washed with basins of water, scrubbed with ash or lye soap, and cleaned their hands and faces daily. Rivers and streams were also used, though often frigid and muddy. Bathing in winter was rare, not out of laziness, but for survival. Wet hair and freezing temperatures could kill you faster than any sin. Clothes weren't washed often, maybe a few times a season. Linen undergarments helped absorb sweat and were easier to clean than woolen outerwear. They'd beat clothes on rocks, hang them in smoke to kill lice, and even sprinkle herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask odors. Then there's the matter of food in winter. No crops, no green, so what did they eat? They relied on preserved goods, salted meats, smoked fish, dried beans, hard cheeses, nuts, grains stored in barrels, and pickled vegetables. Root cellars dug into the earth helped keep food cool but unfrozen, but even then starvation loomed. Winter was when people prayed most, not for snow to melt, but for food to last, for firewood not to run out, for disease not to spread, because in the cold even a simple cough could become a death sentence. And yet they survived, they sang songs, told stories, strengthened community ties around the hearth. They found warmth not just in fire, but in faith, not just in wool, but in ritual. Christmas and winter feasts became spiritual celebrations, not because they were joyful, but because they brought light into the darkest time of year. So how did they stay alive? They endured, they adapted, and somehow, even in the bleakest months, they held on to the belief that spring would return. The term Dark Ages has haunted the early medieval period like a curse whispered across centuries. It evokes images of crumbling ruins, ignorant peasants, burning witches, and a world shackled in superstition and mud. But was it really that bleak, or have we been telling a story shaped by shadows rather than truth? To understand where the idea of the Dark Ages came from, we have to travel not to the Middle Ages themselves, but to the Renaissance. It was thinkers like Petrarch, a 14th-century Italian scholar, who first used the term dark to describe the time between the fall of Rome and the reawakening of classical knowledge. For him and later humanists, this wasn't just history, it was personal. They saw themselves as standing in the light after 1,000 years of cultural nightfall, but that's a biased view and a dangerous one. Because while the Roman roads cracked and statues fell, not all knowledge vanished, not all light was lost. In fact, many historians today are reclaiming the term and pushing back against the idea that the early medieval world was ignorant and uncivilized. Let's break this down. First, was science dead? Absolutely not. While Europe may have lost centralized Roman institutions, knowledge was preserved and advanced, not only in monasteries but also in the Islamic world. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became centers of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. It was during the so-called Dark Ages that scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us algorithm, were laying the groundwork for algebra, while Avicenna wrote the Canon of Medicine, a text that would be used for centuries. Much of this knowledge later flowed back into Europe, especially through translation movements in Spain, and would help ignite the Renaissance itself. Second, was Europe silent and stagnant? Not at all. Consider the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, where education was promoted, script was standardized, Carolingian minuscule, the ancestor of our modern lowercase letters, and art and architecture flourished. Or the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, centers of logic, theology, and law. And let's not forget architecture. The Romanesque churches of the 11th century, with their heavy arches and thick stone walls, gave way to the Gothic cathedrals, soaring structures of stained glass and mathematical precision. These weren't the work of fools or fanatics. They were feats of collective genius. Third, was life truly more brutal than before? Yes and no. Life was harsh, especially for peasants, but it always had been. The Roman Empire, for all its roads and aqueducts, was no utopia. Slavery, war, and inequality were just as rampant, if not more institutionalized. What changed in the early Middle Ages was a shift in values. Christianity, with its emphasis on the poor, the meek, and the afterlife, introduced new moral frameworks. The church didn't always live up to them, of course, but the ideal of compassion, of charity, began to take root more deeply than in pagan Rome. So why does the myth of the Dark Ages persist? Because it's convenient. Because it flatters modernity. Because it tells a neat story, light, darkness, light again. But history isn't neat. It's complex, chaotic, and full of contradictions. Yes, there were plagues. Yes, there was ignorance. But there was also poetry, progress, and profound resilience. The Dark Ages weren't so dark after all. Perhaps the real darkness lies in forgetting the truth. When Rome fell, or more accurately, transformed, it did not vanish in a single day, nor was everything Roman reduced to dust. The year 476, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed, is a convenient marker. But in truth, the end of the Western Roman Empire was more a slow unraveling than a dramatic explosion. So what actually survived the fall of Rome, and what truly died? Let's begin with the ruins, the bones of empire. Physically, the remnants of Roman infrastructure dotted the landscape for centuries. Aqueducts still carried water in parts of Gaul and Hispania long after emperors stopped ruling. Roads, with their layered stones and ingenious drainage systems, continued to guide travelers, armies, and merchants. Roman walls surrounded cities. Amphitheaters and temples, though sometimes repurposed or cannibalized for stone, remained as silent witnesses to a lost grandeur. But it wasn't just stone that survived, ideas endured. Roman law, though fragmented, remained the foundation for many medieval legal systems, especially in the Byzantine East. The Justinian Code, compiled in the 6th century, became a cornerstone of legal thinking in both the East and, eventually, the West again. Latin, the language of empire, did not die, it evolved. What we now call the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, are all the children of vulgar Latin, shaped by the tongues of Germanic invaders and local dialects. Even in England, Latin remained the language of the church, of law, and of education long after the Anglo-Saxons took root. Speaking of the church, perhaps no institution carried the torch of Rome more powerfully than the Catholic Church. When secular authority collapsed, the bishop became the governor, the monastery the library, and the abbot the judge. The Pope in Rome claimed spiritual authority not only over souls, but over kings. Christianity itself had been a minority religion in the empire's earliest days. By the time of its fall, it was the empire's cultural spine, and would remain Europe's dominant spiritual force for the next 1,000 years. But make no mistake, much was lost. The city of Rome itself, once home to over 1 million people, shrank to a ghost town. Literacy plummeted outside the church. Philosophy, science, and mathematics, once taught in public forums and academies, became the domain of isolated monks in foreign lands. Public entertainment died. The gladiatorial games ended. Theaters closed. Public baths fell into ruin not just because of economic collapse, but because Christian morality viewed them as sites of vanity and sin. Monumental architecture paused. There were no new colosseums, no new pantheons. Where the Roman Empire had once built roads across continents, the post-Roman kingdoms struggled to maintain even basic trade routes. Coinage collapsed, barter returned, urban life dimmed, but here's the paradox. What survived flourished in new forms. Charlemagne's empire drew on the image of Rome, calling itself the Holy Roman Empire. His coronation in 800 wasn't just political, it was symbolic. The Roman dream reborn through the church. Even the barbarians, the so-called destroyers, wanted to become Romans. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Franks adopted Latin, Roman law, and Christianity. They didn't want to erase Rome. They wanted to inherit it. In a way, Rome never died, it migrated. It morphed, scattered, and embedded itself in new cultures. So what truly died with Rome? The centralized bureaucracy, the idea of empire as order. The Pax Romana, that fragile peace across continents. But what survived? The language, the law, the faith, and perhaps most importantly, the idea of Rome, a beacon that would continue to haunt and inspire Europe for centuries. We call them the Dark Ages, as if a veil of ignorance and misery fell over Europe for 500 years, as if the fall of Rome extinguished every candle of thought, every spark of progress, and every note of music. When we hear Dark Ages, we imagine barbaric warlords grunting over bone-strewn battlefields, peasants wallowing in filth, and monks hoarding the last scraps of wisdom behind fortress-like monasteries. A world with no light. No beauty, no hope, but what if that story is not history, but propaganda? The phrase Dark Ages didn't even exist during the time it supposedly describes. It was born centuries later in the glowing halls of the Renaissance, when thinkers like Petrarch looked back and declared, with condescending pride, that they had finally escaped a long night of stupidity. They needed the past to look dark so that their present would shine brighter, and so they painted the Middle Ages with shadows, conveniently ignoring the light that still glowed beneath the surface. Yes, Rome had fallen, roads decayed. Trade collapsed in some places, and the Western world reeled from the shock, but it did not fall into chaos, it transformed. New kingdoms rose. The church stepped in to fill the void of empire, yes, but also preserved literacy, law, and administration. The so-called barbarians, they were not mindless destroyers but builders of new societies, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons. They forged identities that still exist today, France, Spain, England. In their hands, Europe did not crumble, it evolved. Even art and science didn't disappear, they migrated. To the monasteries, yes, but also eastward. While Europe reorganized itself, the Islamic world entered its golden age, preserving and expanding upon Greek science, Persian medicine, and Indian mathematics. Knowledge was not dead, it was traveling. And back in Europe, even amid war and uncertainty, people farmed, traded, built churches that scraped the sky, composed songs that carried through cold stone halls, and passed down stories by firelight that would one day become legends. The truth is, the term Dark Ages says more about us than about them. It reflects our arrogance, our craving for neat narratives, our fear of the in-between. We want history to move cleanly, fall, dark, rise, light. But reality is messier, and the centuries between Rome and the Renaissance were full of complexity, growth, struggle, and humanity. So the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were nothing but misery and mud, ask them this. What if we've just been looking with the wrong light? When we picture food in the so-called Dark Ages, we tend to imagine a gray sludge, some unappetizing, lumpy porridge slopped into wooden bowls, eaten in silence by hollow-eyed peasants beside a dying fire. It's an image fed by centuries of cartoons, textbooks, and oversimplified documentaries. But the truth, as always, is far richer and far tastier. The average early medieval person, especially in the countryside, was no stranger to hunger. Famine loomed over every harvest like a specter, but when crops were good and winters were kind, meals were surprisingly diverse, even inventive. The base of most diets was bread. Not white, fluffy loaves like we know today, but dense, hearty rounds made from rye, barley, or oats, often baked in communal ovens shared by entire villages. Alongside bread came vegetables, which were anything but dull. Cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, garlic, peas, and beans were grown in small gardens. Herbs like sage, dill, parsley, and wild mustard gave flavor to otherwise bland stews. People knew how to season, they just did it with what the land offered, not with imported spices. And yes, there was meat. Not every day, not for every person, but certainly not absent. Pigs were the most common livestock, prized for their ability to forage anywhere. Chickens gave eggs and occasional protein. In forested areas, peasants hunted deer, boar, and rabbit when the local lord allowed it. In coastal regions, fish dominated the diet: herring, eel, cod, even shellfish. Fridays and Lent meant no meat, which only encouraged more creative seafood dishes. Perhaps most surprising of all is what they drank. Water, when clean, was used but risky, so most people, even children, drank small beer a week, fermented brew with very low alcohol. Stronger ale was saved for festivals and gatherings. And yes, wine flowed in the halls of nobility, especially in the south, imported from France or Spain or made locally in vineyards tended by monks. And speaking of monks, they were not just spiritual guides. Monasteries were culinary hubs. Benedictine and Cistercian monks meticulously cultivated orchards, herb gardens, and fish ponds. They developed cheese-making techniques, brewed refined beers, and preserved food in ways that would feed not just themselves, but entire communities during hard winters. Let's not forget sweets. Honey was the primary sweetener, and it flavored cakes, sauces, and preserved fruits. Richer households might enjoy spiced pastries on feast days. Even peasants marked holidays with pottage sweetened by apples, berries, or nuts gathered from nearby woods. So was life hard? Yes. Was famine a threat? Always. But to reduce medieval food to gruel is to ignore the creativity of survival. These were people who knew their land, their seasons, their animals, and how to make a little go a long way. Their meals were not just sustenance, they were culture, they were memory. They were survival wrapped in warmth and shared with others beside the fire. And perhaps that is the biggest truth we forget. Medieval food wasn't about Michelin stars. It was about community, ritual, and a deep, intimate relationship with the land that fed them. When we imagine medieval homes, we often see them as cold, damp hovels, cracked wooden beams, thatched roofs leaking in the rain, and smoky interiors with barely a place to sit. And yes, for the poorest in early medieval Europe, life could look like that. But even in the humblest homes, there was more than just survival. There was structure, purpose, and yes, comfort in its own modest form. Let's start at the base of society, the peasant cottage. These weren't the pathetic shacks you see in some Hollywood movies. They were hand-built, often communally from local materials: timber and wattle, clay, straw, and stone. Roofs were thatched, yes, but that thatch was layered thick and sloped steep to shed rain and snow. Inside, space was limited but efficient. Most homes had just one or two rooms, a main room with a hearth at the center, and perhaps a loft or curtained area for sleeping. The hearth was everything. It was the source of warmth, light, and food. Above it hung pots of bubbling stew. Around it, children told stories, mothers spun wool, and fathers carved tools. The smoke from the fire rose through a hole in the roof, or more commonly just filled the rafters and seeped out through cracks. Yes, it was smoky, but it was also alive. Floors were often packed dirt, covered with rushes or straw that were swept and replaced regularly. Furniture was simple: a heavy wooden table, stools, a chest for clothes or grain. But the real heart of the home wasn't the furniture, it was the rhythm of life it held. Morning chores, evening prayers, shared meals, whispered songs. These walls, though bare, were thick with memory. In wealthier homes, merchants, minor nobles, abbots, the picture was different. These homes had multiple rooms, sometimes a second floor, even glass windows in rare cases. Walls might be painted, floors tiled, and wooden beams polished to a soft sheen. These were not castles, but comfortable dwellings, a clear step up in a world where every rung of the social ladder shaped how you lived and what warmth you were allowed. And speaking of castles, we often think of them as luxury homes, but early castles were cold, defensive places. Stone walls kept out invaders, yes, but also trapped cold in. Windows were narrow slits designed for arrows, not sunlight. It wasn't until the later Middle Ages that castles began to adopt tapestries, carpets, and private chambers to soften their fortress-like feel. What's more fascinating is how flexible these homes were. A single room might serve as kitchen, bedroom, and storage area. Beds were often shared, parents and children sleeping side by side, not from poverty alone, but warmth, safety, and tradition. Privacy, as we think of it today, did not exist, but community intimacy did. And even in the poorest huts, you would often find small touches of beauty. A carved wooden spoon, a woven wall hanging, dried herbs hung near the door. Because people, even in hardship, find ways to make a space feel like theirs. So no, they didn't have electricity or running water, but they had homes, real ones. Built with hands, warmed by fire, and filled with the messy, beautiful noise of human life. Because in the Middle Ages, as now, a house was never just a shelter. It was a story, a sanctuary, a place where darkness ended and living began. Clothes in the Dark Ages weren't just about covering your body, they were a declaration. A silent, visual contract that told the world who you were, how much you owned, what you believed, and what you were worth in the grand hierarchy of a deeply unequal world. In a time before last names or ID cards, what you wore could open doors or seal them shut. Let's start with the basics, peasants and common folk. Their clothing was humble, practical, and often handmade. Wool was the fabric of choice, durable, warm, and available from their own sheep. They spun and wove it themselves, dyed it with whatever plants grew nearby. Onion skins for yellow, woad for blue, madder root for red. Most wore a simple tunic or cot, often belted at the waist, with long sleeves to keep out the cold. Men paired it with woolen trousers or leggings. Women added an apron and a head covering like a coif or veil to signify modesty and piety. Footwear, if you were lucky, leather boots or wraparound shoes, but for many, especially children, bare feet were the norm. But don't mistake simplicity for ignorance. These people cared about how they looked. On feast days or weddings, they wore their best, perhaps a tunic with colored trim or a borrowed cloak. A new belt or an iron brooch could be a family treasure. Appearance was a form of pride and survival. Looking too poor might invite pity. Looking too rich might invite punishment. Now step into the world of the nobility. Here, clothes became armor not of steel but of status. Silk, imported through Byzantine or Arab merchants, was the ultimate luxury. Linen, cooler and softer than wool, was reserved for undergarments. Noblemen wore tunics of vivid blues, deep purples, and rich reds, colors often forbidden to commoners. These dyes came from expensive sources, crushed insects, rare minerals, or distant trade routes. Noblewomen's gowns flowed to the ground, often with embroidered hems and sleeves so long they had to be held to walk. Their hair, braided and coiled beneath jeweled nets, was a signal of both wealth and chastity. A noblewoman's headdress could rise half a foot above her head, part fashion, part theater. Then there were the clergy, monks, nuns, and priests. Their clothing was intentionally plain. The Benedictine habit, for example, was black wool, unadorned with a hood and rope belt. But don't be fooled, some bishops wore robes richer than kings. Gold-threaded vestments, jeweled crucifixes, rings of sapphire, because for them it wasn't vanity, it was glory to God. And yes, fashion had rules. Sumptuary laws were passed across Europe, legal codes stating who could wear what. A peasant wearing silk, punishable. A merchant's wife trying to dress above her station, fined. These laws were about maintaining the visual order, ensuring everyone knew their place with just one glance, but there were rebels, too. Young knights with capes too long, daughters of tailors who mimicked noble fashion, traveling minstrels who mixed colors and clashed traditions, the rock stars of the medieval world. So no, people in the Dark Ages weren't all gray and ragged. They dressed with meaning, with defiance, with faith, and with the same desire we carry today to belong, to be seen, and to say something without saying a word. When we think of love in the Dark Ages, our minds might wander to tales of knights and ladies, secret kisses in candlelit halls, or tragic romances sung by wandering minstrels. But real love, the kind that burned quietly by the hearth or was arranged at the foot of a family's fields, looked much different. It was raw, practical, and often not romantic at all. Let's start with marriage. For most people, marriage was less about love and more about land, labor, or alliance. Among peasants, it meant combining farms, gaining hands to help with harvest, and ensuring survival. Among nobles, it meant strategy. Sealing treaties, claiming territory, strengthening dynasties. Fathers chose husbands, mothers negotiated dowries, and brides, often young girls, were expected to obey. Consent, as we understand it today, was fuzzy at best. A girl of 14 or 15 might be married off to a man twice her age. Her opinion mattered little. Virginity, however, mattered greatly, not for virtue, but for legitimacy. A pure bride ensured a pure bloodline, especially among nobility. Failure to prove it could result in annulment or worse, but does that mean there was no love? Not at all. Behind the rigid rules were real people with real hearts. Some couples grew into affection over years of shared work and hardship. Some women, despite arranged unions, found tenderness in their husbands. And yes, some broke the mold completely, falling in love outside their class, defying their parents, or even choosing the convent over the altar. Among the clergy, of course, celibacy was the expectation, at least officially. But human desire doesn't vanish with a robe and a vow. There are countless records of secret affairs, priestly children, and whispered scandals hidden behind stone walls. Now, what about raising children? Childhood in the modern sense didn't exist. A child was either small or useful. At age 5 or 6, peasant children were expected to help in the fields, carry water, watch livestock. By 12, they were little adults, working full days, apprenticed to a trade, or even preparing for marriage. Noble children had a different path. Boys might be sent off as pages at age 7, learning manners and swordplay in a lord's household, while girls were taught embroidery, courtly behavior, and obedience. Education was rare, reserved for the elite or the exceptionally lucky. For most, letters were a mystery, and the Bible, the very foundation of medieval life, remained something heard, not read, and death was always near. 1 in 3 children didn't survive past age 5. Fevers, infections, poor hygiene, and famine took lives quickly. Mothers often bore 10 children to see 5 live. And yet, despite the grief, despite the fear, parents loved fiercely. We find lullabies written in fading ink. We see cribs buried with tiny toys. We read letters from fathers praying for the safety of a son sent to war or a daughter in childbirth. Love in the Dark Ages was not a fairy tale. It was fire lit in the cold. It was a prayer whispered under breath. It was holding on even when everything around you was made to be let go.